Hi, everyone. In previous lectures, we've talked a little bit about adaptation. So let's take a look at natural selection and artificial selection and how that relates to adaptation, because this is going to explain to you essentially the way that evolution itself works. So let's take a look at the difference between natural selection, artificial selection, and what exactly it is. So here's some things that you probably already know about natural selection. One, that it is one of the primary mechanisms for evolution. That evolution is characterized by a change in allele frequencies. Now, we haven't talked about that yet, but maybe from your biology classes, or at some point in your college career or high school career, you know that what allele frequencies are. Alleles are simply versions of genes. So, like the gene, the version of the hair color gene for blonde, or the version of, say, the eye color brown. So for eye color, you might have brown and blue and green and so on and so forth. And of course, that's a lot more complicated, actually, than I'm making it sound. But the gene, a particular version of a gene, is called an allele. Whenever allele frequencies change, how often they occur in a population, that's actually evolution. Evolution is characterized by a change in allele frequency in a population over time. Individuals do not acquire characteristics and then pass on those traits. So if I'm part of a population, I can't acquire some characteristic and then pass on that trait. For instance, I have tattoos. When I have offspring, those offspring are not going to be born with tattoos. So you don't pass on an acquired trait. That's not the way evolution works. Individuals have traits due to mutation. Now, if I had a mutation of some sort, and I don't mean like an X-Men mutation, I'm not going to have fire coming out of my eyes and I'm not going to be able to control the weather. But anytime you change the genetics of something, that's a mutation. And if it's a change in the genetics that gets translated into a change in the genetics that are passed on, then that particular trait gets passed on to the next generation. Traits are things that confer an advantage to live. So within any population of organisms, and we use the term population, we're talking about one species. So within a population of organisms, there are going to be some individuals that naturally have some characteristic due to mutation that gives them an advantage. They might have a slightly higher metabolism or slightly lower metabolism. They might have a slightly longer beak or shorter beak, longer talons. They might be taller or shorter. But whatever that trait is, if it's a trait that gives them some sort of an advantage in the population, those are going to be those are going to be the individuals that live longer, reproduce more, and put their genes in the next generation, which means that the next generation will have more of whatever that allele is, whatever that trait is that conferred the advantage. And that's when you have a population changing. And that's what evolution actually is. And the process that literally selects for those traits is called natural selection. So how do we know what's going on here? Let's take a look at an example. Think about bacteria. Antibiotics are a class of drug that controls the growth of bacteria. You go to the doctor, and he gives you the pink medicine, and which a penicillin-based medicine, and it cures a bacterial infection. Well, it cures bacterial infection by not killing bacteria necessarily, but it prevents them from reproducing because it prevents them from making a cell wall. But there are always going to be some bacteria in a population of bacteria that are either a little resistant or a lot resistant or completely resistant to certain bacteria. So how might bacterial populations become antibiotic resistant? So how could bacterial transformation enhance this antibiotic resistance? So what's going on here? If you use an antibiotic and you use it for instead of using it for the whole amount of time that you're supposed to, you use it for a part of the amount of time. What you're actually going to do is you're going to prevent the weaker bacteria from reproducing. And so the only ones that are going to be left are going to be those that have some resistance to that antibiotic. So they're going to be the ones who reproduce, which means that as they reproduce, more and more of those bacteria are going to be resistant to the antibiotic. Nothing develops this resistance. The population slowly develops resistance to this antibiotic because those individuals that were naturally resistant are the ones who live, reproduce, and put their genes in the next generation. The same thing is true when we think about using pesticides or herbicides. When you spray a field with a pesticide, you're going to kill most of the pests, but there are going to be some that are going to be somewhat resistant to your pesticide. Some of them may survive, and if they survive and put their genes in the next generation, then more pests are going to be resistant to that pesticide, which means that over time you end up with populations that are completely resistant to the pesticide, and so you have to change pesticides. So that's evolution. And we find the same kind of thing with viruses and vaccines. Viruses evolve just like bacteria do, even though we question whether or not a virus is a living thing, and which is kind of a silly question because it's not like its behavior would change if we called it alive or didn't call it alive. But it's not a cell, so we tend to refer to it as not being alive. But it does have genetic material and it does produce a protein coat, and vaccines cause your body to create antibodies to prevent this virus or to help kill off this virus. Well, those viruses that have a protein coat that's different from its predecessors will evade the vaccine. And that's why we have to take a different flu shot every year, because of the fact that the influenza virus evolves over the course of a year, and last year's influenza vaccine may not cause your body to create antibodies to protect you from this year's flu strain, which is why we're going to have to do the same thing with the COVID vaccines. So we'll take both influenza and COVID vaccines at least once a year. So let's take a look at how that's working. If we take a look on the left-hand side of your screen right here, you'll see, for instance, a pest. So if I spray my crop with a particular pesticide, and we can see right here, if I spray with pesticide, and if I end up with killing all of these that have like the green dot, and the red dots survive because they just by mutation had a gene that allowed them to be a little more resistant to this pesticide. Well, look what happens. What are the only ones that are left to reproduce? The ones that contain that gene, that red gene right here, because that's a little chromosome right there. So the one that contained the red gene that allowed them to be resistant, they're the ones who are going to put their genes in the next generation. So in the next generation, you're going to have more pests that are resistant to the pesticide. That's evolution. The allele frequency changed, and so you have a change in allele frequency, and the whole population has evolved. Same thing is true with bacteria. This is the way that we develop drug-resistant bacteria, and that's why we have in the early days of antibiotics, penicillin killed almost everything, and now penicillin in itself will hardly kill anything. Because it was overused. So you're going to have non-resistant bacteria and some resistant bacteria. So when we put them in the presence of antibiotics, it kills all the ones, or it prevents them from reproducing, the ones that don't have the resistance. And so then the only ones that reproduce are the ones that are carrying the resistance. And so now all of a sudden, all of your population of bacteria there are resistant to the antibiotic. So what do you think are some of the causes of natural selection? Well, natural selection has to act on some trait. So there's got to be some physical trait, some trait that will confer some sort of advantage onto an organism. So could traits that are selected in one generation be selected against in the next generation or later? And then what would happen? Well, of course it could, because the environmental situations could change. There could be one type of food available in a particular ecosystem, and then something could happen and that particular food gets wiped out. And so what may have been selected for the ability to eat this particular food as you move from one generation to the next, it may not get selected for in the next generation. And so what you end up with are changes in the population. And this is how populations adapt and, will adapt to a particular environment or to a particular food source. So we have so many birds of the same species but have different types of beaks, because that different type of beak will allow them to develop, will allow them to be more or less successful eating a particular type of food. So natural selection acts on some sort of a phenotypic variation. Phenotype, that's what something looks like as a result of its genetics. There has to be some sort of a phenotypic variation in order for natural selection to act. So what's the source of phenotypic variation? Well, that would be genes, genotypic variation. So the more variation there is in the genes, the more likely it is that there's going to be some phenotypic variation that could end up giving some members of a population an advantage that allows the population to evolve. When environments change, selective pressures will change, and selective pressures are applied to populations. Several times during our own evolutionary history, the food sources that were available changed, and so as a result, early forms of humans either flourished or died depending on the type of food that was available. And those that had the ability to act as generalists and eat multiple types of food, those are the species that survived. And so that's why we're here, because we are generalists. We had the ability to eat not only, fruits and nuts, but also to eat rats, essentially, to all sorts of, there's more protein in a rat than there is in a root. And so we were generalists, and so we were able to overcome a lot of those environmental issues. So let's take a look at some other ways that natural selection acts. If you take a look at the diagram that's in the upper left of your screen, you can see how the coloration of a particular population of mouse might change over time. None of the mice are changing colors, but the population color is changing over time. White mice would be very visible to a predator. If you have a predator that is coming into an area, and it's going to see these white mice a whole lot easier than it sees the darker gray mice. And so those are going to be the ones that it eats most often. Well, what is that going to do? That's going to clear out most of your white mice, and what you're going to end up with are the gray ones. Well, the gray ones then had a selective advantage, so they're the ones who get to reproduce and put their genes in the next generation. And so as the generations move along, you end up with a population that has more gray mice than white mice. That's natural selection. And you can see the same kind of thing going on over here with the butterflies and the caterpillars. The caterpillars that are a certain color are more attractive to certain birds, and so the birds will eat those. And so what happens is you end up with a population of butterflies that mirrors that. Whichever ones survived most often are the ones that get to put their genes in the next generation. Here's the same example, sort of. Snails on a beach. You have a starting population of snails, and you have some brown ones, green ones, blue ones, red ones. So the ones that stick out are the ones that get eaten. And so over time, you end up with a population that kind of evens out with whatever is more camouflaged. And so the population changes. None of these snails changed their color. The ones that had certain colors got eaten. and so they didn't get to reproduce. So only the brown ones got to reproduce, and so they reproduced more, and so you have a population with more brown snails. That's natural selection. This is the way that evolution works. Other examples, let's think. So what are some environmental pressures that have affected organisms as a result of climate change? So as climate change occurs, what are some of the, let's think about some of the things that might happen. And so you can think about this and we'll discuss it in class. What are some things that may change? And think about as the temperature changes, those organisms that have the ability to survive in warmer climates are going to be the ones that get to survive. Right now, I have friends who are working with corals, and they're trying to take a look at the algal symbiont and see which algal symbionts have the ability to live in warmer waters more often. Those are going to be the ones that are going to survive, and that's going to have that's going to cause a real big difference in coral populations as global temperature continues to change. How would spraying for pesticides like DDT cause resistance to pesticide among insects? Now, we don't use DDT anymore in the United States. This was banned in the 1960s, but spraying any kind of pesticide is going to create populations of pests that are resistant to the pesticide. And so it's kind of like a Cold War. You constantly have to change the pesticide in order to keep up with those organisms that are resistant to it. How does evolution explain a genetic disease like sickle cell anemia? Well, sickle cell anemia is a genetic disease that happens as a result of red blood cells literally taking on, rather than being the shape of a donut, or an annulus rather, they're shaped like a sickle. So how did something like this come about, and how does it stay in the population? Well, if somebody has one gene for the sickle cell and one normal gene, those individuals actually have an advantage in equatorial regions because of the slightly changed shape of the certain blood cells, that gives them a resistance to the disease malaria. But if you have two copies of the sickle cell gene, that gives you sickle cell anemia, which is a real serious problem with the individuals who have that. So having sickle cell trait can offer an advantage if you live in an equatorial region, but having sickle cell anemia, meaning that you've got two copies of that, is a serious inhibition. It causes real serious medical issues and a lot of pain. People who have sickle cell anemia have constant pain, especially when they're having episodes. But that's how that sort of a disease evolved, because there's an advantage if you're what's referred to as heterozygote for that particular disease. What is fitness in terms of evolution? Okay, well, fitness means that something has the ability to live, reproduce, and put its genes to the next generation. So when we talk about something have a fitness advantage, we're not talking about going to the gym. We're talking about its ability, that organism's ability to live longer, more successfully, putting more genes in the next generation, producing the most offspring. So there are types of natural selection, and I think that I'm going to stop this particular video here and pick up with types of natural selection in Natural Selection Part 2.